thank you so much for joining me for some quiet time together. In this time, I thought it would be nice for you just to relax and just switch off for a little while, at least, while I read to you from this little Christmas book, the Christmas gift. So make yourself nice and comfortable. Tales to share year after year. If you'd like to get a copy of this book that I wrote, it's on Kindle or, as you can see, paperback on Amazon. A perfect gift to have around the house at Christmas, on a coffee table, under the tree, or by a bed, full of the magic of Christmas. Do you love the wonder and the warmth that Christmas stories can bring? Want a book to bring out every year to enjoy the sentiments of Christmas, with a mug of something warm by the Christmas tree, or in front of the fire to enjoy alone or to share with loved ones? Short stories to go back to time after time as they wrap the spirit of Christmas and all it offers warmly and reassuringly around you, showing you the meaning of Christmas with short stories that combine a mixture of imagination and emotion that are tender, touching, yet resonant. With thought-provoking short stories that are about friendship and loved ones, the magic of Christmas Eve and the wonder of Father Christmas, sharing memories and discovering that seeing is believing and that the impossible may be possible. Discover what fairies do at Christmas and what a Christmas gift can mean. The Christmas gift will delight both young and old, as Christmas is a time for all to share. This is my website, Sleeping Lion Publishers. So are you ready? Are you comfortable? Let's find a story to share. The gift of Christmas. The joys of Christmas had long since been forgotten by old Mrs. Bramley, who lived in the old rectory next to the church. Once an avid choir member and devoted wife to our local vicar, the years hadn't been kind to her. In the last 2 decades, there had been a downward decline as she had to carry the burden and woe of looking after her loving husband, who fell prey to ill health that after a long battle took his last breath, along with her heart, her warm smile, her zest for life, and the joys that not only Christmas could bring, but what she was known to give to others, especially at this time of the year. Many in the village had rallied around to try and help her. They had offered a kind heart and a willing ear, but Mrs. Bramley remained withdrawn. Offers to help with her home and garden had been politely declined, and the beautiful roses that grew once around her door now grew wild, as each day passed their beloved garden turned from a treasure into a place that children didn't like to venture too close to. As the years passed, rumours began to spread amongst the children that behind the brick wall lay await an old lady who locked up children who dared to venture through her rusty gate and into her garden, lured by the smell of freshly baked biscuits, then thrown into her cellar, never to be seen again. The old rectory, although small, had once been pretty and quaint, and had sat before in a pride place next to the new rectory that had been built for the new young vicar and his large family. In recent years, though, Mrs. Bramley's home turned into a tired old house filled with sadness and just memories. James and Lily knew the story of the old lady, but had always wondered if it was true. They didn't think it could be. No one could be that horrid, and often when they walked past the house on their way to school, they would bravely stop and peer through the garden gate. One night, as they both sat on the floor admiring their handiwork of decorating the Christmas tree with baubles in red, gold and silver, lengths of tinsel, strings of lights that Mother had helped them with, and the brightest star that you've ever seen on top of the tree, they spared a thought for the old lady who lived in the run-down rectory and wondered what kind of a Christmas she would be having. Would she even have a Christmas tree? They didn't think so. Mother had often told them stories about her, how she had been so kind, and what a lovely vicar her husband had been. She would rally around making the church look pretty with flowers at Easter and help organise a nativity play for the children at Christmas. The aroma of her freshly baked bread would fill the air, and if she spotted you as you wandered by, a warm wave would usher you in to enjoy a delicious slice with some homemade jam and fresh from the oven biscuits. They made a Christmas pact that, after school the very next day, they would dare to go into the garden and knock on the door. They toyed with a few reasons of why they would be knocking on the door, but decided that they would simply offer their help to rake up some leaves or pull up some of the many weeds that were growing in plenty, and agreed that they would tell a white lie and say it was part of a school project they had to undertake to help an elderly neighbour. The very next day, both children hurried home from school and stopped outside the gate. As they both chewed on a toffee, they peered through into the garden, hesitant that they had made the right decision. But together they pulled the latch down on the gate and opened it slowly. One step at a time, they made their way up towards the front door, trying to follow the footpath but stepping more on the overgrown weeds. As they reached the front of the rectory, they both looked at each other and took a deep breath and bravely knocked twice. But after waiting a moment or two, the door still had not opened. The children decided to knock gently again, and almost as soon as they did, an elderly lady peered out between the closed nets to see who was there. With a little wave, they remained firm and hoped that she would answer the door. It wasn't long before it opened slowly, and Mrs. Bramley appeared. Her face was bemused while two small children would be standing on her doorstep. James and Lily looked at her up and down. She didn't seem scary, just an old lady in a floral dress with a tired-looking cardigan. Her hair short but tidy, with small curls, and later they both agreed that she had a kind face, if not a little sad. They both quietly explained why they were knocking, and waited to see if she would take them up on their offer of doing a few jobs to help her for their school project. After all, it was the season to be both friendly and helpful. Mrs. Bramley thought for a moment and smiled softly. She was quite taken aback that these two sweet children were offering to help her. It had been a long time since someone had knocked on her door to ask if they could help, although she had known it had been her fault. After the death of her beloved husband, she had felt so alone and sad and found it difficult to ask for help. Then time just seemed to slip away along with all the things they used to do together, until she found herself all alone in a tired-looking house and tired of the way the things had become. So Mrs. Bramley accepted their kind offer graciously and invited them back at the weekend to do a few jobs in the garden. Two large smiles grew on the children's faces, and they thanked Mrs. Bramley and hid back up the path with a skip in their step, pleased with themselves that they had remained true and had the courage to knock on her door. After breakfast on the Saturday, the two children, with their parents' permission, dashed over to Mrs. Bramley's house armed with a rake, a bucket, and a trowel to dig up some of her weeds. They were both pleasantly surprised to find the curtains and nets pulled back this time, and as soon as they knocked on the door, Mrs. Bramley opened it up with a cheery smile and thanked them so much for taking the trouble to come over and help. Both children got stuck into their jobs of raking up all the leaves and carefully putting them into the black rubbish bags that their father had given them, and dug around the garden, lifting up one weed at a time. Some were a little prickly, so they had to mind their fingers, but they both felt happy helping Mrs. Bramley, and their mother had been right. It was a nice feeling to help someone else. James and Lily's hard work stopped for a moment when they both looked up and looked at each other. They could smell something delicious coming from inside. It smelt like freshly baked cinnamon biscuits. Now, after the rumours the children had heard, they weren't absolutely sure whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Had she been nice and kind and invited them over with the intention to lure them into the house with the wonderful aroma of freshly baked biscuits only to throw them into her cellar? Mrs. Bramley came out onto her porch and waved them in with an offer of homemade chocolate and fresh out of the oven cinnamon and nutmeg biscuits. The children had been working so hard she thought they must be a little peckish, and the weather was on the chilly side, so the hot chocolate would warm up their hands. James and Lily looked at each other and gulped. The pair put down their tools they were using and walked slowly over to the front door as the smell of the biscuits and the hot chocolate danced around their senses, and before changing their minds they walked shyly into Mrs. Bramley's rectory and the door closed behind them. was quiet, with just the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere. They followed her through the hall and into the lounge. The house, to their surprise, was immaculately clean. But as they imagined, not a Christmas tree in sight. In fact, as they peered around, there was no sign of Christmas whatsoever. James and Lily sat down on the velvet green sofa, and Mrs. Bramley passed them both a plate of biscuits and poured the hot chocolate. They took off their mittens and gloves and unzipped their coats and sat back on the sofa, each contentedly with a biscuit in their hands. The old lady suggested marshmallows would be nice in the hot chocolate, and the children's faces lit up. She really didn't seem very mean at all, and as they bit into the cinnamon and nutmeg biscuit, they delighted in the delicious crunch and the flavours that their mother had been right about. She really did make the best biscuits. James, being the older, decided to be the first to talk politely and asked Mrs. Bramley why she didn't have any Christmas decorations up. It was such a clean, pretty house on the inside, and it would, he thought, look nice. Mrs. Bramley smiled at the children and took a small sigh, then started to talk very softly. She had a calming voice, and the children listened with interest as they enjoyed the biscuits and the wonderful hot chocolate. The day the dear Lord took her husband was the day she felt that a piece of her disappeared too. She had been so grateful of everyone's help and the well wishes, but nothing had felt the same. It was almost, she explained, like a piece of her had died, which meant Christmas too, and she didn't deserve to carry on when her husband wasn't going to be there with her. The children felt a little sad for her. Mrs. Bramley continued for a short while, then asked about them. Before Lily could help herself, she had to ask if the old lady had a cellar. Mrs. Bramley looked quite perplexed. What a strange question. She smiled and shook her head. She said she had a cupboard under the stairs where she stored a lot of the boxes, but she didn't have a cellar, and if she did, she would probably struggle to get up and down it, what with their legs these days. Both the children relaxed that little bit more and looked at the plate of biscuits. Mrs. Bramley laughed softly and ushered them to eat more. She had forgotten how nice it felt to not only have visitors, but to share some of her homemade treats. James asked her if she would be getting a Christmas tree, both still more fascinated in her than themselves. She explained that she didn't think so, and that the Christmas tree had been a job that her husband had enjoyed to do. As she talked, her eyes twinkled as she recalled fond memories of them decking the house with holly and the finest tree that they could find, and candles that lit every corner, and treats one by one coming out of the oven to share with villagers and friends. The two children shared with Mrs. Bramley their plans for Christmas and what they had asked Father Christmas for, as long as they had been good. Hanging on their every word, she told them that they had both been very kind and thoughtful to have knocked on her door, and that she probably thought that Father Christmas could see everything, so he would know this, and so to expect a visit on Christmas Eve. James and Lily's bodies were suddenly filled with excitement and the joy of Christmas, as well as delicious biscuits, but glancing at the nearby clock on the mantelpiece, agreed that they should finish their jobs, particularly if Father Christmas was watching them. All three got up and walked back to the front door. James and Lily thanked Mrs. Bramley for the most delicious biscuits they had ever tasted and the creamy hot chocolate, and promised to tidy up after they had finished in the garden. Mrs. Bramley looked at the two children and choked back a small tear as she thought, if It was them she wanted to thank for opening up her heart again. Yes, it was them that she wanted to thank for opening up her heart again, and that remembering those that are no longer with us should not be suppressed, but celebrated. For it is true that each thought keeps them alive and close to our hearts. As she closed the door behind them, she could hear the pair chatting frantically and laughing as they finished in the garden. When the two children were about to leave, Mrs. Bramley opened the front door, thanked them again, and told them that they were very welcome any time, and certainly now they knew what a nice old lady she was and what delicious treats she could make, they would see her very soon. James and Lily dashed home to tell their mother all about their visit, and Mrs. Bramley sat for a moment in her lounge remembering fond memories until she got up and walked over to the cupboard under the stairs. She opened it up and switched on the light. There in the corner sat 2 boxes marked Christmas decorations. One by one, she moved a few things out of the way and carefully pulled them closer to her. And out from under the stairs, for the next couple of hours, she sat quietly, on her own, going through the boxes and remembering all the warm Christmas memories that she had shared with her husband, decorating the church and their home for Christmas. The delight in the children's and the parents' faces when they performed their nativity play, midnight mass on Christmas Eve, and the feast that she would prepare for Christmas Day. Exchanging a gift or two after dinner, with carols playing and a glass of sherry or two alongside walnuts and oranges and the finest box of chocolates. The very next day, James and Lily made their way back to Mrs. Bramley's house after they had been to church with their parents, with a note from their mother and a small tree that their father had kindly picked up for them that very morning. This time, with no hesitation of walking into the garden, they excitedly knocked on the door, with the tree in one hand between them and a letter tightly gripped in Lily's hand. Mrs. Bramley opened the door with delight to see the two, and laughed mildly with amusement when she saw that the pair had dragged a tree all the way to her house, but warmly invited them in and led them into her lounge. Both the children looked around. It had only been a day, but the room looked so different. Now it felt warm, and there were touches of Christmas in every corner and across the fireplace. But all it was missing was a Christmas tree. Mrs. Bramley showed them the box of decorations and invited them to unpack it, and a large bag that sat inside filled to the brim with the finest tree decorations James and Lily had ever seen. Like jewels they glistened and called the children to be taken out and admired and hung in place on a tree. Mrs. Bramley fetched a small bucket for the tree to stand in, and James dashed outside to fill it up with earth. Then, inside, Lily dressed the bucket with tinsel, and they stood the tree up in the corner by the window. For a small tree, it was still very impressive, thought the pair, and with Mrs. Bramley's permission, eagerly started to dress the Christmas tree. While the 2 children excitedly delved into the box and the bag, Mrs. Bramley pulled out her husband's favourite Christmas record. At Christmas they had both very much enjoyed carols, but it was always tradition to put on a fun Christmas songs as he hung decorations on the tree so that he could sing along. She carefully placed it on the old record player that sat in the middle of the sideboard and listened with delight. Both the children turned as the music started. How they loved Christmas music, and the first song was one of their favourites. Mrs. Bramley closed her eyes for a moment to treasure the memory, then put her hands together and suggested that all that was missing was something delicious to eat and drink. Both the children nodded happily and thanked her greatly before delving back into the tree decorations of coloured baubles, cones and bells and glittery doves, frosted apples and berries on wire that could be teased around each and every branch. Just as Lily remembered, she had a letter. Mrs. Bramley came back in with a tray of goodies and placed it on the coffee table. Lily handed her the letter and explained it was from her mother. Mrs. Bramley sat down, popped on her reading glasses and read it to herself. Dear Mrs. Bramley, I was so happy to hear that you were feeling a bit better after James and Lily's visit, and we wondered whether you would like to join us for Christmas dinner. If so, then please let them know or call me, and you'll find my number on the reverse. We do so hope you can join our family. I have most things prepared, and please don't worry about any gifts, but if you wanted to bring some of your delicious homemade mince pies that I remember so fondly, then that would be simply perfect. She placed the letter down on the table and wiped a tear away from her pale blue eyes from behind her glasses that she took off and rested on her knee. James and Lily stopped what they were doing. They hadn't meant to upset her and asked softly if she was okay and if there was anything they could do. Mrs. Bramley wiped her glasses slowly with a tissue and placed them back on her nose and smiled at the two. With Christmas music filling the room, the delight of Christmas painted across the faces of the children, and the kindness that she had been shown after so many years of hiding herself away and out of touch and reach of any form of affection, she felt alive again. It had been too long, but she was now ready and smiled at James and Lily, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the warmth of Christmas trickle through her veins again and fill her heart with joy. She got up slowly and walked over to the Christmas tree and looked down at the two children kneeling on the floor. She asked the children if they had performed in a nativity play at school that year, but both children hadn't, although Lily had really wanted to play Mary. Mrs. Bramley lowered her voice into a soft whisper and suggested, wouldn't it be a wonderful surprise for their parents if they both performed a small nativity play after Christmas dinner on Christmas Day? James and Lily jumped up with delight. What a splendid idea! But what should they do? Mrs. Bramley explained that she had put together many nativity plays in her years, although not recently, but all they would need were a few sheets, a tea towel, some string, a piece of silver foil and a cushion, and some imagination and a little time to practice, all of which could be done at hers. How wonderful, and what a perfect gift for their mother and father. What a wonderful surprise it will be. Lily thought for a moment longer, but what if she forgot any of the lines? Mrs. Bramley sat back down again and told them to thank their dear mother and father for their kind invitation to spend Christmas dinner with them, and that she would gleefully accept and would certainly bring some of her finest homemade Christmas pies to share with everyone, and so would be there to help the children if they need reminding of their lines. Both James and Lily went over and gave her a big hug. This would be the best Christmas ever. With a few hours after school popping around to practice their nativity play and enjoy all the treats that came freshly out of the oven, aromas once again delighted all as they walked past Mrs. Bramley's old rectory. The top of her beautifully decorated Christmas tree could be seen by passers-by with a golden star right at the very top, which was a gift from her husband, and had always been her job to pop it on last as the finishing touch. As Christmas Day approached, a few flakes of snow began to settle all around. It had been too cold for Mrs. Bramley to go to midnight mass, but she was determined to attend church on Christmas morning, accompanied by James, Lily and her parents. And the season of goodwill was to be felt all around. Joy of Christmas was felt in the hearts by those who could be together, and remembered and cherished for those who could not. Old memories remembered with love and devotion, and new memories created with every flake of snow that fell, every laughter shared, and the two children performing their first nativity play taught them by one of the kindest people they had ever met, with the gift of thoughtfulness and kindness being shared by all, and of course Mrs. Bramley's homemade mince pies. I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope to read another one to you very soon. If you do enjoy me reading to you, as you know how much I like to write and read books and paper, please let me know in the comments below. I do appreciate it, and I completely appreciate you being here with me. This book, as I say, is available on Amazon. Ideal as that little gift to share year after year, as is my journal that I've shared in lots and lots of my videos when we do our scrapbooking, filled with pages to write your wishes and dreams. If you love paper and a new notebook, lists to tick off and notes to inspire you, then thank you for finding me. Please have fun with this book. I have deliberately not put chapters in any particular order because I want you to dip in where you want, when you want. Write a few words, doodle, pause for thought or build dreams. Write wish lists, to-do lists, or anything and everything. Pop notes between the pages, articles you've cut out, postcards and photos. And if you need, stretch an elastic band around this book because it's so squidgy to keep your thoughts and dreams and wishes safe. Use your love lists, notes and me just for you, and with a smile. A lovely little gift for those that love journals, or anyone like me or us that loves paper. Paper. Please take very good care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. And I will see you again very soon.